Every neighborhood has its secrets, but some neighborhoods have something far worse: an HOA that thinks it owns your life. Imagine working hard all year, waiting for the holidays, and finally putting up some Christmas lights to bring joy to your family, only to be told by your HOA that it's against the rules. That's exactly what happened to one family. What started as a simple act of celebration quickly spiraled into one of the most outrageous battles this community had ever seen. At first, the family thought it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe the HOA was overreacting. But when the fines started arriving in the mail, when the threats of legal action began to appear, and when the HOA president himself started showing up to intimidate them, they realized this was no ordinary complaint. This was a fight for control. The HOA wanted complete power, and they chose the wrong family to mess with. What happened next was a story of defiance, creativity, and pure petty revenge. The family didn't back down. In fact, they doubled down. They decided that if the HOA wanted to fight them over Christmas lights, then this holiday season was about to become the most unforgettable one in neighborhood history. Every day, the stakes grew higher. Every night, the lights grew brighter. And with each new escalation, the HOA lost more control, until the entire neighborhood was laughing at their ridiculous rules. By the end, this wasn't just a fight about decorations. It became a full-blown war, a war the HOA never expected to lose. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is not just a story about Christmas lights. It's about standing up to bullies, about neighbors choosing sides, and about how one family turned holiday cheer into the perfect weapon against an HOA drunk with power. And trust me, the ending is something you won't want to miss. It all started in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where lawns were trimmed like clockwork and driveways looked like they had been pressure washed just hours before. Families moved here for the promise of order, peace, and the illusion of a perfect community. But beneath that neatly painted exterior, there was a force far less cheerful, an HOA that prided itself on control. For most of the year, its rules hovered silently over the residents, like storm clouds, rarely noticed until they suddenly struck with fines or threats. And while many homeowners reluctantly accepted these regulations, one family, Mark, his wife Sarah, and their two young kids, were about to learn just how far the HOA would go to maintain its grip. It was late November, just after Thanksgiving. For the family, decorating for Christmas was more than just tradition. It was sacred. Sarah had grown up in a home where Christmas lights spilled across every surface, where neighbors stopped by just to marvel at the glow. For her, it wasn't just decoration, it was memory, joy, and comfort. Mark, though more practical, went along because he saw the happiness it brought his children. Every year, the kids counted down the days until the first lights went up. So as soon as Thanksgiving leftovers were packed away, the family began hauling boxes out of the garage. Ladders were set against the house, extension cords sprawled across the yard, and within hours the first strands of twinkling lights began climbing up the roofline. The kids danced in the driveway, squealing every time another section lit up. To them, it was the beginning of magic. But to the HOA president, it was the beginning of war. The woman's name was Linda, though most residents whispered another title behind her back: the Christmas Grinch. She lived just a few houses away, in a home that looked more like a museum than a place where anyone actually lived. Her curtains were always drawn, her hedges perfectly clipped, and her mailbox had once been polished twice in a single day. Linda didn't tolerate deviations from the rules, and she had been waiting, watching, for anyone who dared break them. When she drove past Mark and Sarah's house that evening and saw the faint glow of lights outlining their roof, her car screeched to a stop. She stared, horrified, at the scene of children laughing and lights twinkling, as if they had personally declared war against her perfect order. That very night, she began drafting an official violation notice. The next morning, Mark found a crisp white envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a letter filled with rigid language: violation of HOA Code 14.7. Seasonal decorations shall not be displayed before December 1st. Immediate removal required. Daily fines will be assessed until compliance is achieved. At the bottom, Linda's signature glared like a scar. Mark laughed at first, shaking his head at how ridiculous it was. It was just a few days before December. Who could possibly care? But as he showed Sarah the letter, her face hardened. She knew Linda's reputation. She knew this wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. Every morning, another letter appeared. The fines began accumulating on paper, each one more aggressive than the last. By the end of the week, the HOA claimed the family owed several $100s. The letters warned that unpaid fines could result in legal action, liens, or even foreclosure. But instead of fear, something else began to take root in Sarah and Mark: defiance. The more they thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. How could celebrating joy, family, and tradition be a crime? Why should one bitter neighbor hold so much power over their lives? And why should their children, who looked forward to these lights all year, be punished for rules that seemed designed only to crush happiness? One night, after the kids were in bed, Sarah sat at the dining table, surrounded by boxes of lights still waiting to be hung. She looked at Mark, her eyes sharp with determination. She wasn't going to take them down. No, she was going to go bigger. If the HOA wanted a fight, then they were about to get one. She began sketching ideas for the most over-the-top Christmas display the neighborhood had ever seen. Not just lights on the roof, but inflatables, synchronized music, and decorations that would be visible from blocks away. She wanted the kind of display people drove miles to see. Mark raised an eyebrow at her plan, but deep down, he felt the same spark of rebellion. It wasn't just about decorations anymore. It was about standing up against an HOA that thrived on intimidation. And so, what began as a simple holiday tradition was about to transform into an all-out battle. As the calendar crept toward December, the family worked in secret. Every day, they added more lights, more extension cords, more figures that filled the yard. They ordered supplies online, picked up clearance decorations, and borrowed from friends. Slowly but surely, their house transformed into something that could no longer be ignored. Neighbors began to notice. Some smiled and whispered encouragement. Others shook their heads, fearful of Linda's wrath, but nobody could deny it. The display was breathtaking, even unfinished. And when the switch was finally flipped for the first full test run, the glow lit up the entire street. Cars slowed down, children pressed their faces to windows, and the air buzzed with excitement. For a brief moment, the family felt triumphant. They had taken their stand. But Linda was watching, and she wasn't about to let this challenge go unanswered. The night the full display lit up for the first time, the neighborhood was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Families came out of their homes just to stand on the sidewalks and watch. Children laughed as inflatable reindeer bobbed in the breeze, and couples strolled slowly past the house, snapping pictures on their phones. Even people from the next subdivision over drove through just to catch a glimpse. But for every smile it inspired, there was one person watching through narrowed eyes. From the shadows of her porch, Linda stood with her arms folded tightly across her chest, her face glowing faintly from the reflection of the lights she despised. To her, this wasn't just decoration, it was defiance, and in her mind, defiance against her rules was the same as chaos. That night she sat at her desk long past midnight, typing furiously. Her letter wasn't just a violation notice this time. It was a full-blown demand for immediate removal, citing multiple sections of the HOA handbook. She accused the family of light pollution, disruption of community harmony, obstruction of common areas, and even, quote, creating unsafe conditions with cords across the lawn. By the time she finished, the letter stretched across 3 pages of accusations. The next morning, Mark found it taped to his door in the usual spot, but this time, something was different. The letter wasn't just from Linda. At the bottom, it carried the HOA board's official stamp. It was clear, Linda had rallied the other members behind her crusade. Over the next few days, the harassment intensified. Letters became thicker, fines piled higher, and threats grew darker. Words like legal action, foreclosure, and removal by force began appearing in bold. Each notice was delivered with an urgency that felt more like intimidation than enforcement. And it didn't stop there. Linda began calling city inspectors, alleging electrical hazards. She reported the family to the fire department, claiming their lights were a fire risk. She even told police that the traffic caused by visitors was a safety concern. Every night, as the lights glowed, a new wave of trouble showed up on the doorstep. But instead of breaking them down, the attacks only hardened Sarah's resolve. She saw how much joy the lights brought to her children, to neighbors who whispered, "Thank you," as they passed by. And she knew, if she gave in now, Linda would never stop. The tension spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some residents, terrified of HOA punishment, kept their heads down and avoided choosing sides. Others grew openly supportive, bringing hot cocoa to the family and offering to help with setup. A few, emboldened by the defiance, even began adding extra decorations to their own homes. For the first time, the HOA's iron grip was showing cracks. Linda, however, was livid. She called emergency meetings, stormed into people's yards demanding they remove decorations, and patrolled the streets at night with a flashlight, searching for violations. But the more she raged, the more people quietly turned against her. The HOA had always ruled with fear, but now, neighbors were starting to realize just how much power they actually had if they stood together. Still, the board pushed forward. A formal summons arrived, an official hearing at the HOA office to address the Christmas light violations. Mark and Sarah were expected to attend, present their case, and face judgment. If they failed, the HOA warned, the matter would escalate to court. The day of the hearing arrived, and the room was already thick with tension. A long table of board members sat with clipboards and files, their expressions cold. Linda sat at the center, practically glowing with smug satisfaction. She believed she had already won. Mark and Sarah walked in, steady but unflinching. They listened as Linda rattled off every violation she had compiled, her voice dripping with venom. She painted their display as a reckless hazard, a public nuisance, even a threat to property values. Each claim was met with nods from a few board members, who scribbled notes like judges preparing to deliver a sentence. But Sarah wasn't about to go down without a fight. She had spent nights gathering evidence, letters from supportive neighbors, notes from local businesses praising the display for drawing families into the area, and even safety certifications for the lights and wiring. One by one, she laid them on the table, countering every accusation Linda made. The board was caught off guard. They had expected fear and submission, not preparation and defiance. And while they remained stern, some members glanced at one another, uneasy. Still, the verdict wasn't in the family's favor. The board declared that the lights violated the HOA's seasonal rules and demanded they be taken down immediately. Fines would continue until full compliance was reached. It seemed like a crushing defeat, but as they walked out of the hearing, Sarah whispered to Mark that it was far from over. Because while the board had its rules, she had something far more powerful on her side: the court of public opinion. And once she lit that fuse, there would be no turning back. When the verdict came down from the HOA hearing, Mark and Sarah knew the battle had only just begun. To the board, it was a simple matter. The rules had been broken, and punishment would follow. But to Sarah, the fight had grown into something bigger than just Christmas decorations. It had become a symbol of freedom, of joy, and of resistance against an HOA that thrived on fear. That night, as the lights flickered on once again, Sarah made a decision. She wasn't just going to keep the display up. She was going to make it impossible for the HOA to ignore. And she wasn't going to do it alone. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Whispers of the unfair hearing circulated. Stories of Linda's fury grew, and soon, people who had remained silent were quietly choosing sides. The next evening, a family across the street added a string of lights to their porch. Then, another neighbor put a small inflatable Santa on their lawn. Within days, houses that had once stood in darkness began to glow with color. It wasn't coordinated, and it wasn't nearly as elaborate as Sarah's display, but it was enough to send a message. The HOA was losing control. But Sarah wasn't finished. She took her fight online. She posted photos of the lights on community groups and shared her story. How the HOA fined her family for celebrating too early, how they called inspectors and police, and how neighbors were being pressured into silence. The post went viral. Strangers commented with outrage. Others shared their own HOA horror stories. And within hours, Sarah had an army of online supporters rallying behind her. It didn't take long before local media caught wind of the story. A small-town newspaper reached out, followed by a local TV station. They asked for interviews, eager to cover the Christmas light controversy brewing in the quiet subdivision. When the story aired, it painted the family as victims of overreach, and the HOA as cold and joyless. Viewers who had never even heard of the neighborhood were suddenly furious on Sarah's behalf. And then came the visitors. Each night, as the lights glowed brighter, Cars began lining the street. Families from outside the community drove in, just to see the infamous display they had seen on the news. Children pressed their noses to car windows, their eyes wide with wonder. Teenagers filmed TikToks with the glowing backdrop. Even elderly couples strolled hand in hand, murmuring about how refreshing it was to see people standing up against the HOA. What had started as a family tradition had become a local attraction, and with every passing night, the crowd grew larger. Linda, of course, was furious. To her, this was chaos. Strangers filled the streets she believed she controlled, and worse, they weren't afraid of her authority. She doubled her efforts, calling the police nightly, demanding they issue citations for traffic congestion, noise, and trespassing. But each time officers arrived, they found nothing more than families enjoying Christmas lights. Some even rolled down their windows, smiled, and told Sarah how much they admired the display. The HOA board grew restless under the mounting pressure. Members who had once nodded, along with Linda's rants, now began questioning whether this was worth the trouble. Letters poured in from residents complaining, not about the lights, but about the harassment, the constant notices, the unrelenting negativity that had overshadowed the holiday season. For the first time, the HOA wasn't united, but Sarah knew better than to assume victory. She understood Linda's personality too well. This wasn't just about rules anymore, it was personal. Linda would stop at nothing to restore control, even if it meant dragging the neighborhood into chaos. So Sarah and Mark doubled down. They added more lights, more inflatables, and even programmed a light show set to music that could be heard faintly from the street. Cars tuned their radios to a posted station and watched in awe as the lights danced in perfect synchronization to Christmas carols. The spectacle drew even bigger crowds, turning their once quiet cul-de-sac into a destination. The neighborhood was divided. Some residents loved the newfound holiday spirit, joining in with decorations of their own. Others grumbled about the traffic and noise, secretly agreeing with Linda but too afraid to speak out. The tension was reaching a breaking point. And then, just when it seemed things couldn't escalate further, a letter arrived that changed everything. This time, it wasn't just a fine or a threat, it was a legal notice. The HOA had officially filed a lawsuit against Mark and Sarah, demanding the removal of the display and payment for damages caused to the community. The letter warned of court dates, legal fees, and the possibility of a lien being placed on their home. It was the harshest blow yet. For most families, such a move would have been enough to force surrender. But Sarah looked at the papers, then at the glowing lights outside her window, and she made a vow. If Linda wanted a war, then a war she would get. And this time, Sarah wasn't just fighting for her family. She was fighting for every neighbor who had ever been silenced, every family who had ever been fined into submission, and every child whose joy had been stolen by petty rules. The HOA had escalated the fight to the courts, but Sarah was ready to escalate it to something even bigger. Something that would leave the board scrambling, powerless, and humiliated. The lights weren't just decorations anymore. They had become a movement. And the next chapter of that movement was about to make headlines far beyond their little neighborhood. The lawsuit was meant to silence Mark and Sarah. To Linda and the HOA board, it was the ultimate weapon, the hammer that would smash through resistance where fines and threats had failed. But what they hadn't anticipated was how quickly the lawsuit itself would backfire. When the legal notice arrived, Sarah didn't crumble. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she picked up the phone and called the same local reporter who had first covered their story. By the next morning, a headline appeared: HOA sues family over Christmas lights. It spread across the internet like wildfire. Within hours, national outlets picked it up. News anchors shook their heads in disbelief as they described a neighborhood association suing over holiday decorations. Social media erupted with outrage, calling the HOA joyless, heartless, and even tyrannical. Memes popped up overnight. Pictures of the Grinch, with Linda's name plastered underneath, captions mocking the idea of suing Christmas itself. The family's once local story had now gone national, and with that exposure came an avalanche of support. Donations poured in through online fundraisers, enough to cover legal fees, and then some. Messages of encouragement flooded Sarah's inbox. Lawyers reached out, offering to represent them for free, just to take a stand against what they called HOA bullying. The lawsuit, meant to isolate and intimidate, had instead turned Sarah and Mark into folk heroes. The first court date arrived on a chilly December morning. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, neighbors, supporters, and reporters holding cameras. Some wore Santa hats. Others held signs reading, "Let the lights shine," and "Stop the HOA Grinch." The scene looked more like a holiday parade than a legal proceeding. Inside, however, the mood was far less cheerful. The HOA's attorney, a stiff man in a gray suit, laid out their argument with precision. He cited bylaws, codes, and technicalities, framing the display as a blatant violation of contractual agreements signed by every homeowner. He spoke of traffic congestion, noise disturbances, and, quote, irreparable harm to property values. Linda sat behind him, her expression triumphant, convinced that the law was on her side. But when it was Sarah's turn, the courtroom shifted. She didn't argue with cold legal jargon. She told a story. She spoke of family traditions, of children's joy, of neighbors finding common ground in something as simple as Christmas lights. She reminded the court that the display wasn't just for her family, but for everyone who came to see it. And then she pulled out stacks of letters, notes from residents supporting the display, testimonials from businesses boosted by the influx of visitors, and statements from city officials confirming that the lights posed no safety hazard. The judge listened intently, his face unreadable. But as Sarah spoke, a murmur of agreement spread through the gallery. Even in a sterile courtroom, the spirit of the lights seemed to glow. The proceedings dragged on for hours. The HOA's attorney attacked relentlessly, but Sarah and her legal team countered every point. The judge declined to make an immediate ruling, instead scheduling another hearing for later in the month. On the surface, it was a stalemate. But in reality, the damage to the HOA's reputation was catastrophic. The news cameras outside captured every moment Linda marched from the courthouse, her face tight with anger. Clips of her refusing to answer reporters. Questions circulated online, cementing her as the face of the war on Christmas. Meanwhile, Sarah and Mark emerged to cheers, holding their children's hands, smiling through the chaos. That image became iconic, a family standing strong against the machinery of control. Back in the neighborhood, the lights only grew brighter. More houses joined in, some stringing up simple decorations, others going all out in solidarity. What had once been Linda's orderly, rule-bound community had transformed into a glowing wonderland. Visitors now came by the hundreds, cars stretching down the street, filling the air with laughter and holiday music. For Linda, it was nothing short of humiliation. Every night, as she sat in her darkened, undecorated house, she watched as her once perfect neighborhood became a carnival of joy she couldn't control. The HOA board was unraveling too. Some members openly questioned whether the lawsuit had been a mistake, while others worried about the financial costs of the battle. Rumors spread that several were considering resigning. But Linda clung to her crusade. She filed additional complaints, pressured city officials, and even attempted to hire private security to, quote, control traffic near Sarah's home. Yet every move she made seemed to ignite more backlash. The community had turned, the media had turned, and even the board was slipping through her fingers. Still, the court case loomed. The next hearing would be decisive. If the HOA somehow managed to convince the judge, they could still force the family to take the display down. And so, as Christmas approached, the entire neighborhood braced for the outcome. Would the lights be shut down under legal order, or would the family's defiance finally bring the HOA to its knees? The answer was coming soon. And Linda was already plotting her next move, one that would push the fight into dangerous new territory. By mid-December, the neighborhood had transformed into something unrecognizable. What was once a sterile, rule-bound subdivision had become a spectacle of holiday spirit. Lights glittered from rooftops, inflatables waved in the breeze, and streams of cars filled the streets each night. Children laughed, families sang along to carols, and even strangers brought donations of hot chocolate and cookies for the crowds. But while the neighborhood basked in joy, Linda seethed in isolation. She rarely left her house now, except to storm into late-night HOA meetings where she demanded action. Her neighbors, once obedient, now looked at her with barely concealed contempt. The board, fractured and weary, struggled to maintain unity. Several members had already distanced themselves, refusing to be associated with the lawsuit that had turned into a national embarrassment. For Linda, though, the humiliation was unbearable. She had built her identity around control, around enforcing the rules no matter how small or petty. And now, she was losing to lights, losing to laughter, losing to a family that refused to bow. And so, in her desperation, she turned to something darker. It started with whispers. Neighbors noticed strange behavior. Linda walking through the streets late at night, carrying a flashlight, muttering as she scribbled in a notebook. Some claimed they saw her peering over fences. Others swore they caught her inspecting extension cords with suspicious intensity. Rumors spread that she was looking for a way to shut the display down, not through letters or lawsuits, but through sabotage. Then came the first incident. One morning, Sarah discovered several strands of lights in their front yard had gone dark. At first, she assumed a fuse had blown, but when Mark inspected the cords, he found they had been deliberately cut, clean slices, as though made with scissors or a knife. Shocked, they replaced the cords, brushed it off as a fluke, and carried on. But a few nights later, more lights failed. Then, inflatables mysteriously deflated, their power sources unplugged. Extension cords were found coiled strangely, as if tampered with. Each time, Mark and Sarah repaired the damage, refusing to give Linda the satisfaction of seeing them quit. Word spread quickly, and soon the neighborhood was buzzing. Some believed it was Linda, others thought she had enlisted help. But one thing was clear. The sabotage wasn't random. Someone was trying to destroy the display piece by piece. The family decided to fight back not just with repairs, but with evidence. Mark installed cameras around the yard, discreetly hidden among decorations. For several nights, nothing happened. The lights burned brightly, the crowds gathered, and the cameras rolled silently. Then, just days before Christmas, the footage caught her. In the grainy glow of the cameras, a figure crept across the yard after midnight. Dressed in dark clothes, she crouched near the decorations, fumbling with cords. When she looked up briefly, the camera captured her face. Linda. It was undeniable. The HOA president, the self-proclaimed protector of the neighborhood, had been caught red-handed, trying to sabotage a family's holiday display. When Sarah reviewed the footage, her heart pounded with both outrage and relief. They finally had proof, evidence that Linda's crusade had crossed a line from harassment to vandalism. But instead of rushing straight to the police, Sarah decided to wait. She wanted the timing to be perfect. Meanwhile, the HOA's grip was collapsing entirely. The lawsuit had drained resources, the media had turned the community into a laughingstock, and now members were resigning one after another. Residents openly decorated their homes without fear, emboldened by the growing rebellion. The once feared HOA had become a shell of itself, a fractured board clinging to authority that no one respected anymore. Linda, however, refused to admit defeat. She doubled down, sending more letters, more threats, even as fewer and fewer people bothered to read them. She raged at neighbors who ignored her orders, screamed at passing cars for blocking her driveway, and carried herself like a ruler betrayed by her kingdom. But Sarah knew the end was near. With the footage of Linda's sabotage in her possession, she prepared for the final blow. It wasn't just about defending her family anymore. It was about ending Linda's reign of fear, once and for all. And as Christmas Eve approached, with the lights glowing brighter than ever and the lawsuit teetering on collapse, Sarah planned to reveal the truth in a way that no one, not the HOA, not the board, and certainly not Linda, could ignore. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and when it came, it would leave the entire neighborhood changed forever. Christmas Eve arrived, and the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Families decorated last-minute cookies, children rehearsed carols, and cars lined up early just to catch a glimpse of the legendary display. The lights, now brighter than ever, glowed across the street like a beacon, reflecting off snow-dusted lawns. For Sarah and Mark, it was more than just another night. It was the culmination of weeks of defiance, struggle, and community support. They knew the crowds would be larger than ever. They knew reporters would show up again, cameras ready. And they knew Linda would be watching from the shadows, desperate to cling to the control she had already lost. But this time, Sarah had a card to play. The cameras Mark had installed had captured everything. Clear as day, Linda had been caught slashing cords and tampering with decorations. It was more than HOA enforcement now. It was criminal vandalism, and Sarah had chosen this night, Christmas Eve, to reveal it to everyone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the street filled with cars. Neighbors gathered in clusters, sipping cocoa and singing along to the synchronized light show. The atmosphere was electric, festive, unstoppable. Even families from nearby towns showed up. eager to witness the now famous HOA versus Christmas lights house. Then, as the display reached its peak, Sarah stepped forward. With a deep breath, she addressed the crowd, her voice carrying over the music. She thanked everyone for their support, spoke of family traditions, and the joy of community spirit. And then, with the kind of calm confidence that only comes when victory is certain, she played the footage. A screen had been set up near the garage, connected to a projector. The crowd fell silent as the grainy video began to play. At first, it showed only the twinkle of lights in the dark. But then, a figure appeared. A woman in dark clothes crouched near the decorations, fumbling with cords. And then, her face lifted just enough for the camera to capture it. Linda. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people covered their mouths, others exchanged shocked looks. Whispers grew into murmurs, murmurs into exclamations. There was no denying it. Linda, the president of the HOA, the self-appointed guardian of order, had been sabotaging her neighbors in the dead of night. And just as Sarah had expected, Linda herself was in the crowd. The moment her face appeared on the screen, she froze. Her usual smugness evaporated, replaced by sheer panic. Neighbors who had once cowered under her rules now turned their eyes on her, expressions filled with disgust, anger, and betrayal. She tried to protest, to wave it off, but her words were drowned by the weight of undeniable evidence. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously, and in that instant, Linda's carefully constructed image collapsed. The fallout was immediate. Several neighbors called out openly, demanding her resignation from the HOA. Others booed, jeered, even shouted at her to leave. The once feared president was now the neighborhood pariah, her authority shattered beyond repair. And the consequences didn't stop there. Sarah handed the footage directly to local police officers who had come to monitor traffic. Within days, Linda faced charges for vandalism and trespassing. The HOA board, already weakened by resignations and infighting, dissolved entirely under the weight of public shame. The lawsuit against Sarah and Mark was dropped unceremoniously, their legal fees already covered by donations from supporters across the country. The neighborhood, free from the iron grip of its HOA, became something new. For the first time in years, residents decorated without fear, gathered without suspicion, and lived without the constant shadow of fines and threats. The community thrived in a way it never had before. And at the heart of it all stood the house that started it, the house that had dared to shine brighter than the rules allowed. That Christmas Eve became legendary. Every year after, families returned to the same street to celebrate, bringing decorations of their own, turning the neighborhood into a festival of lights. What began as one family's tradition became a community-wide event, a symbol of freedom and unity. As for Linda, her name became a cautionary tale. She moved away quietly in the months that followed, unable to bear the stares, the whispers, the humiliation. And though she tried to rebuild her life elsewhere, her story lived on, forever remembered as the HOA president who tried to ban Christmas and lost. For Sarah and Mark, victory wasn't just about keeping their lights. It was about proving that joy, tradition, and community spirit could outshine even the darkest forces of control. And every December, as the first strands of lights went up, their children remembered the year they didn't just celebrate Christmas, they saved it. Because in the end, the HOA tried to ban their lights, but instead, those lights lit up the world. And so, what began as a simple fine over Christmas lights ended up exposing just how powerless the HOA really was when a community decided they'd had enough. The family's lights didn't just brighten their home, they lit up the entire neighborhood with the spirit of defiance. In the end, the HOA's threats and fines collapsed under the weight of their own pettiness. And maybe, just maybe, they learned that rules don't matter when they're used as weapons instead of guidance. But this story is just one of many. HOAs all over the country continue to push boundaries with outrageous demands. And not every family fights back. Some win, some lose, and some turn the tables in ways nobody saw coming. If you thought this battle was wild, wait until you hear what happened when one HOA tried to ban a veteran from flying the American flag in his own yard. That story is even crazier. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.